Hello and welcome to Unwatchables, where the only thing to fear is fear itself, and sometimes some nasty movies. I am Marc Dottavio.
And I'm Seth Troyer.
And today we are joined by film critic Guy Lodge of The Guardian and Variety to talk two controversial landmarks in queer cinema. Both of these films were released in the span of 1 to 2 years in the early 80s, and both pushed boundaries with their unflinching and sometimes very explicit depiction of the lives of gay men. First up is the final and most provocative film, arguably, of legendary German filmmaker Rainer Werner Fassbinder, 1982's Querelle, followed by 1980's daringly graphic cult classic TAXI ZUM KLO, aka Taxi to the Toilet. And here to help us on our way to that toilet, thank you. With us is Guy Lodge. He is a film columnist for The Observer and chief UK film critic for Variety. He's been published in countless other places, such as Newsweek, The LA Times, Time Out, The Playlist, and Vanity Fair. You can also check out filmoftheweek.co.uk, where he is the joint editor-in-chief. Guy, thank you so much for joining us at this late London hour.
Thank you so much for having me. And I think it feels right to discuss these two movies at a late hour, I think. So, I think I'm on the right clock here. So you guys have to catch up.
For us, it's dinner time. It's all about, appetite.
Yeah. And if you're not watching the video version right now, I'm actually in a bathroom. So this works perfectly. But Guy, thanks so much for joining us. I know that before we get into these films, I know that, you have a pretty regular gigs out there, doing reviews and film columns for Variety and The Guardian. But could you tell us a little bit about Film of the Week? Because that sounds like, is that kind of like a pet project of yours?
Yeah, it actually started during the pandemic. My kind of longtime friend and colleague, Catherine Bray, and I, we'd been wanting to kind of do something together and figure out a project. And it kind of, during the pandemic, it became clear to us that people were kind of struggling to find things to watch, or they didn't know kind of what to watch, because there's so many choices out there, even whether it's just streaming or even kind of when, at that point the cinemas were closed, but since then they've opened, which only kind of makes the choice even more daunting. And for a lot of people who, only have time to watch, we watch everything. Not everyone has that amount of time. So we decided that we'd have just a very simple kind of weekly recommendation where we pick like one film from all the noise, whether it's, something that's in theaters or on a streaming platform, but a film that we like, that we think other people will like. We write like one quite short review of it, nothing too kind of taxing, keep it kind of light, keep it conversational, and recommend that to people every week. We send it out via newsletter as well, we've since then got about kind of 2,000 subscribers. It's what started out as a kind of little hobby project has, since it grown into something bigger than we planned, and we're thrilled with that.
All right, so make sure you go and check that out if you have not already. That's filmoftheweek.co.uk.
I've heard lovely things from people. That's one of the ones I have definitely heard of.
Oh, thank you so much. We have a lot of fun with it, and Catherine and I have both quite different styles, which I think is why it works very well. She's a wonderful writer. She's very kind of funny. She's very she kind of shoots from the hip. I kind of have, a slightly more, a slightly kind of different tone, I think, because I'm so used to kind of writing in more of a variety kind of way. The contrast is what makes it work.
All right. So the film this week, at least the first one that we're going to be starting off with, is Querelle. But I do want to ask, I guess, a little bit. That's the score directly from the movie. Thank you.
That's from. I just played that sound clip. I just to get us in there. It's that haunting operatic music in this. It's actually pretty awesome, and sets the tone.
Yeah, actually, if you turn on the subtitles on the Criterion channel when you watch Querelle, every time that little music cue plays, it says "spiritual drone."
Really?
Yeah,
I
and
love
I thought
titles.
that's what a great way to describe that. So, but yeah, so this was. I do want to talk a little bit about why you decided to pick this. I know that you mentioned that you were giving a talk about this at you said the Melbourne Film Festival.
Yes, yeah. That was 2 weeks ago actually.
Oh, that's amazing.
Yeah, went all the way to Australia for the Melbourne Film Festival. Not just to show Querelle, but they do a project there called Critics Campus, where kind of experienced critics and international critics come out to mentor kind of young writers and aspiring critics. We do kind of lots of workshops and panels and kind of one-on-one mentoring sessions. And as an additional thing, they asked the kind of guest critics if they would all pick a movie that we felt had been either kind of in history, either underrated or misunderstood, and has since been kind of reevaluated to screen as part of the festival, and then to have a kind of post-screening discussion of it afterwards. So I picked Querelle, and we screened it to a sold-out house, actually, at their very big kind of flagship festival theater, which was a amazing experience, especially considering we were up against the quarterfinals of the Women's Soccer World Cup, which Australia was playing in that night. So I kind of thought we would be doomed, and yet people still kind of defied the odds to come watch. And we had a great discussion afterwards with Michael Koreski, the wonderful editor of Reverse Shot, and Stephen Russell, a great local Australian critic. And yeah, I think we all learned a lot in the process. It's a film that kind of, you learn a lot about it when you kind of see it through other people's eyes as well.
And before we dive straight into that, just as background for anybody listening, this was the final film of Rainer Werner Fassbinder, this was the ninth. I had not previously seen this. This ended up being the ninth movie that I've saw by him, which for most directors who died at the age of 37 would be a pretty high number of movies. However, Fassbinder, I think between 67 and 82, made over 40 films, plus TV serials and plays. He was extremely prolific.
And
so I'm only scratched the surface.
Of it all. It's crazy.
Insanely so, yeah. I mean, we have no idea what what his kind of output would have been if he had kind of lived even to the age of 40. It blows my mind. I'm older than he was now, and what have we all done with our lives?
Exactly. And even though you'd think, well, at least he got all of those in, it really does feel like he was almost just getting started with some of the stuff he was doing shortly before his death. And Querelle came out after he died. I think maybe the year right after that he died. And, I don't know if there's a bigger name associated with New German cinema than Fassbinder. Usually the era itself tends to get lumped in with exactly, when he stopped making films. And he has such a specific style that draws on, I'm sure we'll talk about, Hollywood melodramas, kind of experimental film techniques, social critiques, and of course, queer themes, which is probably most overtly explored in Querelle. It's actually dedicated to I would try to say his name right, El Hadi Ben Salem, who is the star of his film Ali, Fear Eats the Soul, and often on Lover, as far as I understand.
Yes. Yeah, who's I believe whose life kind of ended rather tragically as well. And it was kind of a personal project for Fassbinder, even though it was an adaptation of a of a Jean Genet story. And Jean Genet, of course, a kind of hugely influential queer French writer and poet and filmmaker as well. So kind of lots of kind of layers of text and influence there, and yet it still feels like one of kind of Fassbinder's most kind of intimate and revealing works.
Yeah, I had to assume this is actually the only Fassbender I've seen, and I had to assume this is his most overtly queer because I don't know how you get more overtly queer than the name. And you like stop what you're doing and look up the poster online right now, which is the first thing that drew me to this movie years ago. It is a young man holding a knife in a sort of phallic way, and as if that's not enough, his back is against a large tower that it looks exactly like a penis. It's not that it looks like a penis; it's a brick penis.
Which
and
is
you
in
see
the
them
actual
in the
movie.
movie.
Yeah,
It's like right at the beginning. The boys are on their boat and they're pulling into shore, and there's large phallic pillars waiting for
We're
them.
going to be saying the word phallic a lot, I think, over the next hour. I appreciate the
And
positioning of
penis
your
and cock,
microphone, by the
probably.
way. It's very that's quite phallic too. And yeah, it's I mean, Fassbinder, a lot of his work had kind of queer themes and queer overtones, and one of his films, Fox and His Friends, was very much about kind of queer relationships, but this was I think the most erotic film he's certainly made kind of in that department, and kind of a break from his previous work in many ways. This was in a much more kind of stylized, heightened register than a lot of what he had made. A lot of his films focused on women, whereas this was very much, it's apart from Jean Moreau at the center of it. It's an entirely kind of, it's a complete sausage fest, really. So and a kind of atypical work in a lot of ways, which is interesting because it often gets, because it was happened to be his last film, it often gets sort of talked about as like an epitaph for his career, or the summation of his career, whereas it really could have just been the start of a whole new phase. We'll never know.
Yeah, I love how romantically it's all shot. It feels first and foremost like a fantasy, like a very much stylized. It feels like a play, like that you're watching. The costumes are gaudy, like all the sets are kind of just haphazardly put together, but in an elegant sort of way. Like all the lighting is very beautiful. Like for me, that is like what I walk away with is just how beautiful, like the emphasis on the orange and blue lighting. Everything is so like hazy and over dramatic, and it just flows into the melodramatic plot that's going on, which is very like lovers quarrels, backstabbing secrets, and all this stuff. I did find it interesting that while it is like a tribute to Jean Genet's book, Marc was telling me that like basically, and I looked it up, it kind of tears up the book quite a bit, which it feels very literate. Like it feels very like an adaptation. I mean, it's like full of narration throughout the whole thing. I was kind of hoping Marc would have done the opening of this episode in the guy's voice, which is just telling you everything that's going on about how death is linked to love and everything. But
he kind of sounds like Adam West.
A little bit. Yeah. And then there's like these slides that aren't translated, at least in the Tubi version that I watched, which I loved, but which was just very mysterious. They're just not translated.
The beginning of the film, it says it's a film about Jean Genet's Querelle of Brest, which again I haven't read, but I have read that Fassbinder called it a fairly uninteresting third-class story about a criminal, I think was the term that he used.
That's so transgressive of him.
Yeah, I think Fassbinder was much less interested in the story, which, as you said, he's kind of completely chopped up and rearranged here, and just so much more interested in the atmospherics and the environment and the kind of just the kind of erotic dynamics at play in this world of kind of sailors, sailors on shore and the kind of the hangers on who revolve around them. It's yeah, and as you say, it's this extraordinary feat of, I mean, we use the word world building a lot these days, and this is quite literal world building, because I think it's one of the great sets ever constructed for cinema, because it's, you know, it's the supposedly the port city of Brest, but it's entirely kind of a set and a soundstage. Every part of it is artificial, and I think it's so beautiful. Every kind of detail, whether it's the kind of bar that they all hang out in, or the ships that they supposedly work on, even though you never really see anyone working in this, um, in this film. And even, even the trees are visibly fake, and as you say, all those incredibly kind of phallic pillars that they all kind of lean seductively against. It's every part of this world is sort of a prop designed to kind of heighten the, this kind of carnal atmosphere of the whole thing.
Oh
Yeah,
man, yeah,
even the
they'll show up all
backdrops are.
sweaty and
Yeah.
like covered in
Oh yeah.
soot, but you'll never like see them doing any of that work. It is all
No,
like
no.
they're already in the midst of break time. It's eternal break
Exactly.
time, and them like leaning against trees, just oh, woe is me, you know.
This is the boat I'd like to work on if I was a sailor. So I sent out
Oh,
an
me too.
application. We'll see what happens. Yeah. But you're right. Even the backdrops of the sky are always clearly painted. And,
Yeah.
He has, of course, been influenced pretty vocally by directors like Douglas Sirk and American melodramas throughout all of his career. But this definitely amps up, even compared to someone like Sirk, the artificiality, the expressionistic lighting, and the color schemes that he likes to work in all of his movies always tend to be not quite the ones you normally see. There's lots of orange and yellow and
this kind of permanent twilight.
Which it kind of sometimes reminds me of like those 70s houses that will have weird, like kind of yellowish carpet and brown couches and things like that. Things that are
I couldn't
gaudy.
find anything like linking him with Kenneth Anger. Like this really like gave me some Kenneth Anger vibes, and I wondered if like they'd be like best chums, or maybe something more even.
I think you're right. There's a kind of spiritual connection there for sure.
Fireworks as a movie, kind of.
Yeah, it's hard to really find a direct analog in a modern director, I think, with him. And again, this movie isn't totally representative of everything that he was doing. He worked in black and white really beautifully in Veronica Voss, which is one of my favorites. But this is definitely the least naturalistic film on every level that I'd ever seen by him. And the way that he shoots his films are just so beautiful. Outside of the lighting, the way he frames shots is very recognizable to me. That there's lots of using mirrors and rearranging bodies in the frame so that a shot will start as its own very carefully blocked composition and then end up as another very carefully blocked composition, sometimes using just the architecture of the set or just the way people are standing in relation to each other. And that stuff is all very much in evidence here as well.
Yeah. And I think sometimes he's even kind of cheekily playing with the aesthetics of pornography as well, or certainly as pornography was kind of back then in the early 80s and late 70s. There's lots of that kind of gauzy, soft lighting, particularly during the kind of sex scenes. And I think there is a kind of wink towards kind of low culture and high culture in the same frame. I really love that about it.
And especially the performances seem deliberately stilted to me here, which there are times when I was pretty sure I was hearing overdubbing being done, which I'm not sure if that was an intentional choice as far as keeping up this kind of artificial performance style, because I'm pretty sure this is the only movie of his I've seen so far that's in English.
Yes. Yeah.
I don't know how many of those he did.
Even though it was apparently originally released in the US, dubbed into German, to amplify its foreignness or whatever. So, as you say, I think there are layers of kind of linguistic dubbing and whatever else has appeared. But yes, it is, in its original form supposed to be in English, and there is a kind of palpable second language quality to that, and the writing is slightly kind of stiff and artificial at points in ways that feel quite deliberate, and that extends into the performance style as well.
Well, and let's get into what this film is doing on this podcast, basically, is because this was a very frank in its way and reasonably direct film that in places is kind of dealing with gay hookup culture. But again, in a very stylized way. The next movie we're going to talk about will probably give you a much more like accurate picture of what that would actually look like in that time and place. But they are very frank about certain things in this. Even starting to like describe the plot is daunting for me because there's so much going on here. But Querelle is this handsome sailor, basically, who has a captain who is obsessed with him, and he's always recording monologues about him into a tape recorder. And wherever they dock seems to be a pretty easy gay hookup place. And I don't know, there's all kinds of stuff. If anyone else was going to take a stab at it, we do it better than me. But there's murders that happen and an investigation. And
Querelle murders a man basically because it seems as though he's pissed that he's not flirting with him or something.
Yes, the one person in the dock who isn't flirting with Querelle.
Yeah, in the whole movie.
Yeah,
which
and then
I kind of
manages
love
to
that.
basically get another sailor to another laborer to kind of to take the blame for this murder along with another murder. It's all a very kind of complicated chain of crimes and punishments of the wrong people. And it's all gets kind of very messy and there's lots of especially there's lots of kind of sexual bartering as well going on between Querelle and the various men who desire him, the kind of owner of the bar where the kind of sailors all hang out, and who is kind of married to Jeanne Moreau, who's sort of the diva kind of chanteuse of this bar as well. And yet, she seems repeatedly perplexed that no man in this entire kind of realm is interested in her.
And right, even though she's this like faded, like starlet kind of lady, and she's like the only lady amongst all these gay men. But the whole trick of the movie, it seems like what the movie really thrives on is that tension that maybe is a little bit foreign to us now in a more accepting age, but that tension between like men being around other men who maybe have desires and they can't say it even when it's happening, and they still have like there's still a constant fronting even though there's like anal sex is happening. They're still like, well, it's just my ass, all right, it's not any, and I'm not a fairy. There's like they'll go back and forth for a long time, both of them legitimizing what is going on. Everybody is very like in very interesting ways, kind of like in their own weird closet.
Yeah, there's still a great deal of kind of shame attached to all the sex in this film, which is really interesting because in another respect, it's incredibly kind of frank and candid about sex, and yet, whenever kind of Querelle has sex with the man, it's always, as you say, it's always kind of couched in these terms of like it's just bodily. This doesn't mean anything. I'm not really gay. It's just, this is just something we're doing. I find that so interesting because, Fassbinder himself was, very, kind of proudly gay, was not, ashamed of it in any way, even though he had his own kind of various kind of psychological demons to battle. But it's an interesting kind of pre-AIDS depiction of on the one hand kind of great sexual liberty, but still with this kind of curtain of denial and shame around it. And I think that's quite kind of reflective of the period it was made in.
And probably of the like when Jean Genet was writing this, way before that. I know that he was in World War II, but was dishonorably just discharged for like basically homosexual acts, quote
Yeah.
unquote. Which I'm sure a lot of this comes from that, at least in some way, of him, having his affairs with men that probably very much acted like this in some way or another, but probably not speaking in such Shakespearean ways about it all.
Yeah, and
Yeah,
this
exactly.
isn't that, as far as being graphic, I think this is much more frank in the dialogue than in anything you really see. So, again, a big contrast with the other film that we're talking about.
Yeah.
But probably, I don't know, maybe the most memorable scene in this, or one of the most memorable scenes, is this dice game that he plays with the owner of the bar. And apparently he does this with a lot of people, where if they win, then they get to have sex with his wife. And if he wins, then he gets to have sex with them. And yeah,
And then
you
they
are
have sex with his
wondering,
wife.
right? And it either goes well or poorly for Querelle, depending on what you're thinking he wants to happen with that.
Yeah.
And I guess that is part of the mystery there, at least for a while, because like you said, everybody wants him, and it's a little blurry about who he actually wants, at least for a while. And yeah, that's one of the more interesting things about this movie. And I know Fassbinder himself, I believe, had relationships with women as well. So there is kind of this omnisexuality aspect going on to it.
Yeah, Fassbinder was just, I think, quite, sexually voracious, just in all directions. And yeah, that's I think, I think Querelle does kind of slightly reflect the kind of breadth of his kind of sexual interests and sexual appetite. But yeah, as you say, there's this gay sex in Querelle is always presented as kind of a something that's inflicted on other people as a result of kind of losing a game or losing a bet, even though in this case Querelle always deliberately throws the dice games that he will, quote unquote, lose and have to have sex with the barman. It feels like no one ever wins a game against the barman. It's an interesting one. And yeah, I think and yet there's also just a lot of very genuine desire in it. Franco Nero plays the captain of the ship, who is kind of fixated on Querelle and desires nothing more, and consistently kind of protects him and saves his ass. And finally, there's almost a weird kind of happy ending for them both, and yet the film always is a little bit kind of elusive on that point.
And that's the aspect that made me think, and I'm sure that this other movie has to come into people's minds when they watch this, which is Claire Denis' Beau Travail, I think is how you say it.
Beau Travail. Yeah.
Beau Travail. And partly because of the kind of superior who is obsessed with the younger person. Yeah. Also, there's this policeman character. I'm not even sure if he's a real policeman or not, but he wears this kind of leather outfit, which is close to what that character in Beau Travail is wearing at the end. Actually made me think of, it's funny too, because originally your first idea was to pair this with Cruising, which we just talked about that last week. And the timing is actually pretty great here, because first of all, that outfit reminded me of some outfits that we see in that movie. And that also is tackling this gay hookup culture, which would have been a great pairing with this, although I'm glad it gave us an opportunity to check out TAXI ZUM KLO. But yeah, were there any more thoughts specific to that as far as that comparison goes? Because that's definitely a movie probably a lot more people have seen that, or I don't even know if it was necessarily a deliberate homage, but it feels to me like it would have to be.
It's interesting, yeah, because I think, Claire Denis' film was officially based on kind of Herman Melville's Billy Budd, but it was a very kind of loose adaptation of that. And I think, as you say, it incorporated, I think, a wealth of kind of past depictions of kind of hypermasculinity, particularly in the military, and kind of male archetypes. I mean, so I think there is quite a lot of Jean Genet that bleeds into leads into her film as well. I cannot imagine it was accidental, because nothing Claire Denis makes is by accident. And I think Beau Travail, which is one of my favorite films as well, was a much more kind of disciplined and restrained and kind of contained film than than Querelle is. The queerness of it is much more kind of beneath the surface and kind of contained glances and gestures. And but I'm glad you brought that up, because I think they do kind of speak to each other, and they both kind of have this interest in both in kind of masculine iconography, whether it's kind of uniform or kind of military kind of power kind of playing, and just in the kind of in the beauty of the male body. And they both actually shoot the male body in quite similar ways, kind of just incredibly kind of carefully lit, and every kind of bead of sweat is sort of highlighted like a like it's a sort of Renaissance painting in some ways. And yeah, I think that would be a great double feature together.
Absolutely. And
all aboard.
Yeah. And so I do want to talk about the approach to storytelling in here, because there is pretty much wall-to-wall narration in this movie. And that's what I think stopped me from liking this as much as some of Fassbinder's other movies. That
it's debatably one of the more unwatchable parts of it. Even it's like, maybe you're not like a conservative prude dad or something, but like even just following all the threads and all the melodrama and stuff, like it can be kind of exhausting.
And all these layers of voiceover as well, because it's there's this kind of omniscient narrator, and then there's the ship's captain who narrates, and then there's another source as well, and you're kind of trying to keep all these voices kind of separate in your head, but they all kind of add up to this. They kind of wind up kind of combining into this one kind of this weird kind of slightly horny voice of God that permeates through the whole film.
Which is just everyone being so self-absorbed, which is such a huge part of this, is everyone's so horny and so into the fact that they're horny, and everything about themselves that's going through that process.
Which is funny, because apparently I don't know how much of what we're hearing actually comes from the book, because it sounds like Fassbinder was just throwing... For all I know, most of that stuff was invented or written by him, but it plays very much like an adaptation to me, which I have pretty strong thoughts about the typical pitfalls about adaptations of literary source material, which is basically that, a paragraph of beautiful prose just is not going to translate in a literal way when you reduce it down to the plot of whatever you're watching. And so you can either try to find a visual corollary, or you don't. And that's usually how a lot of adaptations turn out, that I don't care for. Or you put that prose in narration in people's mouths constantly. And neither of those approaches really work great for me, mainly because we're just constantly having the characters' motivations described to us and explained. And then sometimes it's diving into the themes. And this movie goes as far as to sometimes just go to a black or white screen, and now we're reading it instead
just
of
have chunks of text
hearing
on the screen, which is really...
And if you watch it on Tubi, you won't even know what it says.
Well, they are translated on the Criterion channel, but it's a lot of stuff that you've heard throughout. I guess even omniscient narrators need like a bathroom break every once in a while. Be like, you just read this part, and I'll be right back.
They would follow up voiceover, following up a journal entry,
right?
And now a slate. It's amazing.
And even when characters talk, a lot of times it's the guy monologuing into his tape recorder, or just talking to each other, monologuing to each other about what they're feeling. So as soon as Querelle shows up at the
his
bar,
mouth too, sometimes.
Right. At one point, it even freeze frames just so that the narrator can get his 2 cents in before they continue on with the scene.
Oh, that was wild. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, and by the way, there was some deep spiritual longing inside. It was so
Right.
cool. It's crazy.
And I think like Fassbinder had great kind of reverence for Genet's kind of words and for his imagery, and just less interest in his story. So that's why you sometimes have these quite odd, these quite sort of odd interludes where he just kind of decides to focus on the words alone, sometimes in the literal form of kind of on-screen text, and the storytelling has to kind of completely stall or pause, like just so he can kind of get that out of his system and then kind of move on with his own vision a bit more. It's and I think it's as you said, when he described it as not so much an adaptation as a film about this text, which is such a strange and kind of fascinating compromise for another artist to make. But it's why those, as much as I love the film, those kind of transitions and connections, it never quite feels like a fluid, a fluid interpretation of or a fluid kind of merging of his sensibility with Genet's. There's always this sort of strange kind of friction between the two.
Yeah, because visually and formally, I think this is beyond reproach. It just looks beautiful in every way, and it's very compelling on that level. And it's strange that at the same time, this is the most boldly stylized of all of his movies that I've seen, and yet at the same time, then there's something uncinematic to me about how the story is told. And it kind of just takes for granted all these character relationships, as if describing them to me will be as interesting as actually seeing them, unfold. So I think the issue for me is too much of it, I think, wouldn't have come across at all without that voiceover. So that might just be, a matter of taste. That how much you like this movie will depend on how much you get out of that kind of storytelling juxtaposed with the visual elements, which I'm not sure. It definitely helps keep the interest. I'm not sure how much they complement each other. And I always felt at arm's length from the actual story or characters, or getting involved in a way that, at the end of Beau Travail, we have this wonderful, one of the best endings ever, I think, that has this moment of transcendence, where the captain or legionnaire or whoever goes out and like dancing in a club that's totally unexpected. And some sort of
such kind of catharsis in Querelle. It kind of leaves you in limbo.
But then again, I'm also a little bit of a heretic on not liking Beau Travail as much as other people. So maybe there's no version of this that would have just appealed to me. But they both have a very, portentous, operatic feel to them, and you're either on board or you're not.
See, while I like this movie more than you, I can definitely get on board with what you're saying about that, because I do think there's only so much, I don't know, you could do with this kind of story. It is soap opera. It's being filmed in this sweeping, like, stagey way. I don't really know. It is just what it is for me, and you kind of just have to behold it, and it might be kind of a taxing experience for most viewers. In a certain respect, because after a while you can only take so much of this like self-absorption, which it is like about that. It is just it's about just like a overtaxing of self-absorption and desire, and just never fulfilling that appetite, and the appetite is never fulfilled. And that's kind of how I feel as a viewer by the end, which I don't know if that's intentional or not, but it does make me feel like I did get inside the movie in a certain way and felt what was maybe intended, which is that sort of, it's just supposed to be longing, and it is unrequited.
And there is a kind of the film has definitely this kind of distancing quality to it that maybe feels in parts like it overshoots on that front, but it does also kind of feel kind of appropriate for this examination of kind of fairly cold, unattainable beauty, particularly in the form of Querelle himself, who I think Brad Davis, the American actor who was at that point kind of most famous for Midnight Express, playing the lead in that.
He's so
And
beautiful. It's
he's so
ridiculous.
beautiful, and he a very interesting kind of tragic figure as an actor as well. He was kind of openly bisexual. He died of AIDS a few years, I think, kind of in the early 90s.
He was
And
91.
yeah, his career never really quite kind of took off after Querelle, but like what an interesting choice for him to have made, because he plays him as this as this completely kind of beautiful but strangely kind of compelling cipher, and that feels quite deliberate.
Yeah, and to me, so I mean, just my final thoughts on the topic basically is this is most fascinating to me as a taste of what might have come had Fassbinder survived, and you just he himself and so many of these people in his orbit were these kind of tragic gay or bi or somehow queer people, whether it's the Salem who this is dedicated to, Fassbinder himself, or the main actor. And it does feel like he was constantly on the cusp of something else. And stylistically, again, I don't necessarily see that many people who I could easily compare to him. I think sensibility wise, just as far as queer themes, there's people like Todd Haynes or Greg Araki, but they don't necessarily look like anything that he did, and certainly not like what he did here. So this is just another fascinating glimpse of like a new frontier that he might have been right on the edge of.
Exactly. And I mean, it's interesting you mentioned Todd Haynes, whose early film Poison owes quite a lot to Jean Genet and to Querelle as well. And it does feel like there's a sort of bridging of generations that might have happened there. And also we'll never know kind of how Fassbinder might have kind of addressed the the AIDS era, and that kind of how that kind of then affected this whole new generation of queer filmmakers. He really kind of he died right at the kind of beginning of a new kind of a very different kind of political dynamic shift in queer culture and queer cinema in general.
Yep. So anything else, Seth, before we moved on to another time, just a year prior to this?
Another time for Cox.
Yeah. Anytime's good
I don't
time.
know. I think this is just such a beautiful oddity of a movie, which is always something that I am happy to run into. I think it's frustrating, not for me, because I don't know, I can get on its level with its difficulty and its strangeness. There is something about this that I do wish was a little more giving to an audience, or let a more mainstream audience in, because it, like, on paper, again, if you like throw this poster at somebody, like some like gay kid getting into film, like this could be like a very exciting prospect, but in like by the like 45 minutes in, it can start to feel a little like, which is part of it, it is like this sort of malaise. It's trying to emit this malaise of being a bored beautiful angel kind of, which can get boring for you too, a little bit, but it is just so gorgeous, and Brad is amazing in it, I think. And I do enjoy that sort of like, I don't know, that melodramatic back and forth silly acting that goes on in this. I don't know. It's a whopper and a weird one, and I like it.
My relationship has kind of shifted over the years as well. I mean, I first saw it like as a teenager, when I was kind of drawn in by the imagery, and which in so many ways it's kind of more iconic than the film itself, as you were describing earlier, that poster, and just the image of kind of Brad Davis in that coat and that kind of that sailor's cap, which was then kind of reappropriated by Jean-Paul Gaultier and so much of his fashion design, and became this real this kind of codified kind of queer image in itself. But I think I was kind of drawn in by all that kind of outward appeal, and then I was kind of perplexed by the film itself, by by those very distancing qualities that we were just discussing. And then I kind of returned to it a bit later in my 20s, and I think had more kind of patience for what it was doing, and more, and kind of, I think, understood the the kind of comedy of it as well, because there is this kind of strange kind of deadpan tone of kind of comedy throughout as well. But yeah, it's one that each time I view it, I think I come at it a little bit differently.
And I wasn't able to find too much about how this was received at the time. It didn't seem like was it that controversial? Because I read that it actually did pretty well, at least in Paris when it premiered, and that maybe this was more of a gateway rather than something that was off-putting to people, at least as far as the subject matter goes.
Well, Paris would be down. I don't know about anybody else.
Right, yeah.
Trust the French. But yeah, it was not kind of overly enthusiastically kind of received, particularly in the States. I mean, you can actually read Vincent Canby wrote a really damning review for the New York Times at the time, which I think was quite representative of how a lot of the kind of straight male critical fraternity viewed the film, which was a sort of grudging admiration for its aesthetic kind of accomplishments, but slightly just baffled by its by its kind of general fragmented, disconnected horniness. And I think there's a phrase in his review that I think is very telling, where he refers to kind of Fassbinder's aggressively uncompromising homosexuality. And I think it's always very interesting when queerness is always framed as aggressive.
If only you could compromise.
Yeah.
Jesus,
as if there's this kind of just threat to the very existence of sexuality.
Well, I'd be very curious to see how he would think about this next movie we're going to talk about, which is 1981's TAXI ZUM KLO, or Taxi to the Toilet, which was filmed...
My Own Private Idaho, I gotta say. It's a whole lot less.
Yes, also a German film, but came out just the year before, shot on location in West Berlin, with extras starring as themselves. I think most of them just use their same real names as the character names in it. And this is very much a time capsule of this pre-AIDS moment in a much more realistic way than Querelle is. But it all comes from this guy I had never heard of named Frank Riplow, who is the star, writer, and director of this film. And as far as I know, he did follow it up with a sequel like 6 or 7 years later which
I've never seen, and it didn't really kind of, I think, never really took off, and nothing else he made ever really kind of made much of a dent either. He just had this one kind of landmark,
which is such a shame, because it fucking rules. I think it's really awesome. I don't know, that's my spoiler.
No, it's so great. And I mean, everything about Querelle that is that is heightened and stylized and
withholding
and kind of at a remove is here, just immediate and real and everyday, and it's kind of I think a celebration in many ways of everyday queer life that many people were living, but was never really presented on screen that way.
Absolutely. And by the way, I learned that he has a very small role in Querelle.
Yes. Which
I didn't pick him out.
Happy to pair the two. Yeah, he's one of the kind of legionnaires in Querelle.
Yeah, he's just credited as drunken legionnaire, but I watched this one afterwards, so I didn't see him myself, but I imagine he would have fit in.
There might be a slightly different facial hair situation between the two, but he has a kind of splendid beard in TAXI ZUM KLO.
Yes, lots of splendid facial hair in this movie. Lots of mustaches.
So I don't get to pee on Brad? I thought that's right.
So yeah, I think this was revolutionary on two different fronts. One is just how matter-of-factly it treats this guy's life. It doesn't sugarcoat things, but it's also not alarmist in any way about the way his life goes. But also, even if this was about a straight man, this is a very explicit movie that there's all kinds of what I'm sure were unsimulated sex scenes in it.
Yep.
Lots of graphic nudity. A lot of parts reminded me of the like 70s golden age of porn movies, which we did an episode on. That were, we'll just throw in, extremely explicit nudity and sex in there. And sometimes it's a little bit, I wouldn't say it plays like porns. A lot of times it's very just casual and direct. Yeah. There are some scenes that seem like, they're playful in that way, that I wouldn't necessarily call gratuitous, but it's not like it's trying to be unerotic or anything about it. And
no, it's just a big part of this guy's life at this point. Like this is, and it's important for us to like really get in there, and like if we're really going to spend time in this guy's head and really feel like we're a part of his experience, like that's a big part of his experience, not just like the fact that he has a lot of sex, but we need to go in there and like see what's going on and maybe why this is so exciting or what is he up to. I think it kind of does it a discredit to like lump it in with porn. I do think if it like came out now, the comparison would never happen. Like if these like similar scenes were in a movie now, it would just still be seen as like festival gay art movie,
Yeah.
Well, just don't let any Gen Z people see it, because there will be a Twitter discourse for months.
Yeah, all the people who say, sex scenes don't move the story forward. I mean, I think in this case, it's more the story moving the sex scenes forward, because I think if you took the sex scenes out of this movie, you wouldn't have much movie left.
Sure.
But yeah, I think it aims to kind of demystify gay sex in a very kind of frank and forthright, but not particularly kind of show-offy way. And it's, the kind of casual nudity of it all is a big part of that. I mean, it's so interesting still to this day how kind of male full frontal nudity is still this kind of taboo that films kind of, do almost anything to kind of skirt around. And here, there are just so many dicks just kind of hanging out. We kind of see them, in action, out of action, just and there's kind of so many of them that you do kind of eventually get, you kind of get desensitized to it, which is sort of the point. It's like, it's no longer like, oh wow, look at that. It's more like, well, yeah, this is just his life, and this is how he lives, and there's nothing particularly kind of special or outrageous about this. To him, this is this is just sort of normal everyday pleasure. And I love how it does that. And I think, I think from the very kind of first shot of the film, where you kind of catch him kind of lying naked in bed, and it's kind of shot we've seen before of like, just it's kind of from the back, and there's his ass, and then you just see like a little bit of ball sack kind of below that, which is something you would never see in a similarly framed shot in another movie. There'll always be a kind of way to avoid that. And then and then kind of a few minutes later, he's just like on the toilet, and you get all the kind of sound effects that go with that, and it's kind of gross, but it's also just very normal as well. And I love,
because it is.
I love how kind of completely kind of unashamed and and just kind of accepting the film is of kind of all manner of bodily functions, whether it's sex or otherwise.
Yeah, and it's playful about it too. It's really interesting. The way this movie starts out is almost farcical, where he gets locked out of his apartment naked, and he ends up climbing nude across like the balconies to get back inside. Like this is going to end up being this goofy pop song playing.
House.
Yeah. And so I was kind of wondering, what is the tone this movie is going to hit? But afterwards, then he shows up with his classroom, because he's a teacher, and these are really young kids. And he comes in and then he does this pantomime for them about what happened to him this morning, and asks them to figure out what story he's telling. And he uses that as a segue into a lesson and them reading their own assignments about unlucky situations. And that was when I realized, like, oh, this is something special. Like, this is lovely. This rapport that he has with the kids. And the movie never makes any big thing about it, about any kind of point. There's not some big conflict that comes up with him at the school. This is just
Right, you keep
part of his
waiting for the
life.
principal to barge in,
Yeah.
especially at a certain point where he, like later on, that's the constant problem, is him balancing like his quote unquote normal life with his
Yeah.
nightlife, right, and his sexual adventures and things like that. And he eventually, at one point, even comes in drag and stuff, and you're just like waiting for the principal to come in and start the next act, where like
Yeah.
he loses everything and he's fired and all the children are crying, and like, no, it never happens. There's never
Yeah.
like some kid complains or something. It's handled very beautifully, and he's like immediately charming, and it kind of lasts the whole movie. He's and in a very, like, I don't know, yeah, it seems as though we are getting, at least in that first scene that Mark talked about with the miming and everything, that like at least a little bit of a window into who this guy actually is, as the director, like who he actually is, which, yeah, it's kind of surprising how fast it works.
Yeah, and one of the reasons I kind of wanted to talk about this film is because I think it's actually quite a relevant and quite topical film now in this kind of age of renewed kind of homophobia. If you look at, things like the "Don't Say Gay" bill and the kind of paranoia around um, around kind of queer teaching in schools and whatever, it sort of feels like we've come, or rather reverted all the way back to, when those were kind of points of cultural panic. And the way this film kind of addresses that, and again kind of takes all that completely in stride and doesn't see any um, any kind of controversy in it, or it's all just kind of different parts of life kind of intersecting in fairly kind of in kind of casual and permeable and normal ways. And I think if this film was released now, I think there would still be certain people would still be up in arms about it.
Yeah, and the whole nature of the movie is it's really this freewheeling, mostly plotless slice of life film that's not trying to make any big points really in either direction. It's just the actual casualness of it that feels so bracing even to this day, that everything is fine. But it's not like it acts like he doesn't have any conflicts, because this is a very pre-AIDS movie where there's all kinds of casual sex happening everywhere. And even at the point where he ends up in the hospital with some kind of STD that, for a long time, it seems like it's still like just another thing that happens. And it almost becomes more about an argument with his partner about not getting the right health insurance, and him still sneaking out of the hospital to seek out this rendezvous. And you could look at this. There's something universal about how this is, even though it's very specific about his life as a gay male, it's, to him, this is more about relationships, and particularly struggling with monogamy, which almost anybody could relate to.
Yeah, and it's still very much, from then until now and way before as well, that's always been the sort of the kind of quandary of kind of gay men in relationships, is when the kind of need for partnership versus the need for kind of um, sexual variety and sexual discovery. And the protagonist Frank in this film, who is very much based on the director himself and played by the director too, you know forms a kind of comfortable relationship with with Burns, his wonderfully kind of mustached boyfriend.
It was like
And they
George
have
Kuchar.
yes
Beautiful George Kuchar.
and they have a very kind of cozy relationship, but then the kind of the sexual spark that dies out. And while Burns doesn't have that much appetite in that way, Frank really does, and needs to kind of be with other people and kind of explore other kind of avenues, and this becomes a kind of point of conflict in their relationship. And I still know so many people who go through that exact that exact kind of transition in their relationship, and it's kind of intensely relatable, and I think not necessarily just for queer audiences. Even I think it the way it kind of treats I think a gay relationship in much the same sort of sympathetic way that many kind of films about straight marriage would as well. I think that was quite groundbreaking for the time. We hadn't really seen a film about sort of just gay couples experiencing kind of relationship trouble um, in this very normal and sympathetic and everyday way.
I think it is very universal because it hit me like, I mean, he's just at that we can see it, he's just at that age, he's at
Yeah,
that point in his life where he's trying to figure out, like, in various ways, like, do I dig in here, am I going to, like, is this what I'm going to be doing, is this the person I'm going to be with, is this the life I'm going to now have for until I'm an old man, or am I going to, like, shake it up another time while I
yeah,
still have time? It's really is like a wonderful exercise and a good lesson for people trying to do like autobiography, I would imagine.
yeah,
And I don't even know like what lessons to like really even pinpoint because it seems so effortless in the way that it doesn't feel like an ego trip. And I don't think it's out of like, it's not like he's embarrassing himself or like lampooning himself. He still like makes himself very charming
mm,
and makes his whole plight very relatable. Like the whole, like, oh my God, the whole driving around at night, just listing off your cares and worries is like something, no, like everyone does that. There's no way you're not a person doing that right now. Um, but yeah, somehow it doesn't feel self-important,
yeah,
and it never like, and it seems to recall like the films of like Mike Lee or something. I think maybe that plays into it, as I wouldn't call it plotless, and I wouldn't call Mike Lee plotless either, because there is such a specific atmosphere and thrust to those, but there is like this whole it's more of a refreshing approach
yeah,
that like the scene isn't suddenly announcing itself as, oh, this is one of those rising action scenes, isn't it? Oh, this is one of those falling action scenes, isn't it? Well, you could probably categorize it as that. Like there is something here that is, yeah, it's not, it's just giving a life and giving a story rather than, I don't know, like something that is adhering to some design is to get a reaction out of you.
yeah. I
It,
think Mike Lee is such a good comparison because he's one of those filmmakers who sort of understands that just ordinary everyday life is full of incident. I mean, every day we live the little kind of little crises that we kind of manage and work through, and those are kind of dramatically interesting when you kind of zoom in on them close up, and I think Riplo gets that as well, and as you say, uh yeah, the film is full of um full of quite significant consequential things that happen. The film just doesn't build its narrative around a few of them, and it doesn't have these sort of huge peaks and valleys. It's just this kind of flow of of events and instance that kind of that add up to a kind of bigger picture of a life. I mean, as you were saying earlier, when he when he goes to hospital with an STD, and I think in another film that would sort of be treated as a big dramatic pivot or a kind of point of realization, and no, it's just here, it's just another thing that leads on to the next thing, and that's really for the most part how our lives work. We think we might kind of you know change after a certain thing that happens, and then we revert to old habits, and I think this film kind of follows that pattern beautifully.
it almost reflects Querelle in this sense of wondering throughout, what if this guy had gone on to make more movies? And I'm not sure what the reason is that he didn't, because I believe he at least lived into the early 2000s.
Mm.
And so I'm not sure what the reason is that he didn't pick up a film career after this, but it does seem like a early promising, work of something that might have gotten even better as he went. Cause there is a a kind of ramshackle quality to a lot of this. Obviously, it's very low budget, and but occasionally we do get a nice shot, like the boyfriend watching him having sex, like unexpectedly through a broken window or something. And sometimes there's some clever intercutting. Although there's a lot of intercutting here that I wasn't totally sure why. It was more like, why are we going back and forth between the boyfriend petting a lamb and him giving a lesson in drag, or him having a sex pissing into some guy's mouth, while very unsimulated, by the way. Make sure that if you're going to do it, make sure that you make it clear that this is not fake, with some sort of conversation with a lady that. And then at the other time, there's a really curious scene that I want to get everybody's take on too, which it seems to be the most purposeful instance of this, where we have the boyfriend and Wally, whoever this friend character is supposed to be, watching like an instructional or educational film that's basically warning against gay male predators. Like this guy is molesting a young boy.
Which was real. It was a real film.
A real instructional film, right. Mm-hmm. And that's being intercut with Frank actually like tutoring a young boy. And so at first I think that the obvious intent there must be, okay, look at this is the fear-mongering version, and this is him actually just connecting with the kid. There's certain parts of it like
the kid is like flirting with him though, which is like a reverse of what's going on in the informational film, where the like man is flirting with the boy uncomfortably. In his scenes, we intercut to him tutoring a boy who is flirting with him, and he's uncomfortable about it.
Yeah.
Which I guess
or it might just be.
I like to think is just comedic. I don't know if there's any I don't know what the possible undercurrent could be, but
I think it's kind of a clumsy joke to cut from the man just starting to make advances on the boy to the boy jumping into Frank's lap and going, "Let's play horsey." And so I think he might have kind of bungled it in execution. Although I assume that has to be his. Words. I assume that has to be the intent, at least, though, is to take the piss out of the instructional film, right?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it's kind of drawing attention also to the kind of moral panic that some people would have had around kind of gay men teaching children, because at that time, and often still in many circles, there's this sort of extremely kind of irresponsible and unfair kind of linking of homosexuality with pedophilia, as if they're sort of somehow inextricably related.
Whoever they want to demonize, that's the first tactic that they take.
And I think the incorporation of that kind of archival film, which is so interesting because the film has these little kind of inserts of archival material throughout, and then it kind of culminates in this much longer piece. I think, it is kind of intended to kind of undermine this quite sort of outdated notion, and the film itself is so kind of so quaint and so dated, and in contrast to the to the kind of very fresh modernity of TAXI ZUM KLO itself. And I think that it's so, we've already seen so many scenes of kind of Frank in class with the children, and he's so great with them, and he's so kind of gentle and kind of treats them very much kind of as equals, and he's obviously a really kind of gifted teacher. And I think and even then when he's kind of tutoring this other boy, he's he's kind of genuinely kind of dedicated to his job in this sense, and he wants to help, and I think it's the sort of contrast, which, as you say, is a little bit kind of heavily underlined and a little bit kind of clunky in some ways, but I think it does make quite a strong moral point about I think then quite a prevalent prejudice that many people had, and still do. I mean, it's interesting. There's a British film that was made about 2 years before called Nighthawks, also about very much in a realist mode about a gay man in London who works as a teacher in this case kind of in a high school, and who at one point has his kind of sexuality is discovered by one of the boys in his school. I think they kind of see him out in the town, or I can't remember what it is, and so he turns it into a kind of lesson where they kind of just ask him questions and he answers them kind of very frankly to kind of try and kind of defuse the situation and defuse their prejudice as well. And this kind of I think tries to make the same point in a much more kind of light and comic way.
Yeah, outside of that one scene,
and I appreciate,
just outside of that one scene that's juxtaposes that, the instructional video, I like how it doesn't strain to make that point and doesn't make the movie about his persecution. And that was just very refreshing, especially when you get to that scene where he shows up to class in drag unwisely after a night of partying. But it's handled with candor. The kids are giggling about it, and he's okay with that. Them thinking it's funny that this guy with a beard is dressed like a lady, and he just uses it to launch into a lesson, and it doesn't become a big thing either moralistically or as making any kind of message either way out of it.
Yeah, even if you feel that there's a message being pushed, it is just, it's fair for him to push something because, there is such a frustrating aspect to the fact that if you think about it, that it is so absurd that this person needs, that this group of people, there's many people like him that are teachers in this time like that he's in, or people that are like in all walks of life that deal with children, that they would feel the need to go out of their way to make various scenes and make various gestures as to like inform the general public that they are not pedophiles, which is just like, only speaks to the problem in the society that they're in and the absolute unfairness. It only speaks to that, and it's wild. Yeah, it's so sad, but like wonderful that he can do it with such grace and like,
And the film is, I think, so perceptive on the kind of tacit and sort of implied kind of shaming that gay men kind of face in everyday contexts. There's a great scene where he goes for a medical kind of checkup because he thinks he has an STD, and they basically do a kind of anal probe, and the doctor kind of says, well, this would happen to someone who has sort of anal intercourse, and kind of looks at Frank in this incredibly kind of judgmental kind of leading way, and the film doesn't build to a confrontation because, as we've discussed before, it's not that kind of film. It's just this, just another thing that Frank has to kind of take in stride, and it's just another kind of piece of the everyday life of a kind of gay man in that era of Germany. And I think it handles those little kind of microaggressions so well.
Yeah, I think it's details like that do make this movie greater than the sum of its parts, that it's giving you this window in where maybe not every single scene or decision is a highlight or a memorable, but the cumulative result of it is something that's invaluable and very charming and playful. And so if that's maybe the best thing about it is that kind of modesty to its aims, which might also be a little bit of what kept me from full out loving it, in that, it does seem to just kind of stop at the end instead of really end in a particular way. But it's like I said, a time capsule, an artifact, and it has all of these great little details and glimpses of a filmmaker who might have been. There's a very funny, just little aside moment where the boyfriend is talking to a travel agent and is like sneaking a handful of candy out of a jar, and the movie just like becomes for a little bit about him stealing all this candy.
Yes,
and that's the kind of texture that I appreciate in something like this. And also, we found that there is a video on YouTube of Siskel and Ebert reviewing this on their television show.
Oh,
as much as
really?
this is so obscure and we like both had trouble finding it at a certain point, it was yeah, Ebert and Roper.
Yeah, or Siskel at this point, because this is
I
yeah,
can't
like right when it
I
came out.
can't keep
Whoever the other
those
guy is,
chuckleheads straight.
yeah, and they both really liked it too. So
Oh,
you could
good for
see
them.
that.
Yeah.
Yeah, and they hardly even seem to comment on the, the explicitness of it, and they just seem to really appreciate the it as this little gem
Yeah.
and the casualness of its treatment of everything. So good on them, and look that up. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
very interesting.
Makes sense given that Ebert was quite a horn dog himself, but I'm glad he was kind of an equal opportunity horn dog.
Valley of the Dolls.
Because I mean, the one I think also the great thing about TAXI ZUM KLO is it just takes kind of great joy in sex as well. I mean, there are these kind of various explicit sex scenes, and
Yeah, God
yeah, and
forbid.
they're presented in this mostly quite um, quite exhilarated kind of celebratory way, but it's not um, it's not highly kind of aestheticized or eroticized. It's it's often the way real life sex is. It's often quite kind of clumsy, and there's grunting, and their kind of limbs getting in the way everywhere, and it's it's usually quite sort of flatly lit, the way most of us don't get to have sex under kind of Querelle standards of lighting,
Oh
and
man.
it presents it all in this very kind of unglamorous kind of real world way that's still extremely hot, kind of for that realism, and I love that about it.
Yeah, I agree. And so I want to give everyone a chance to make any final points or anything that we haven't gotten to as far as this. It sounds like we all really liked it. And I'm really glad that in a way we ended up have already doing cruising last week. So it gave us a chance to become aware of this film, because it's just hard to find. If this sounds interesting to anybody, I would probably recommend Illicit Means to go out and find it. There might be some DVDs out there or something, but this is really ripe for a restoration, and get it out there on the Criterion
Oh my
channel
God.
and put it
Yeah.
along in the same, series that Querelle is in. And it's a
Yeah.
very likable and approachable film. And especially it's just, you can't take it outside of the context which is what makes it still so refreshing to see.
Yeah, and I mean it's kind of interesting to discuss it the week after you were talking about cruising, because it's kind of the anti-cruising in many ways, because
Mhm.
it kind of depicts cruising culture, but where Friedkin's film presents it in this, it sort of amplifies the danger and darkness and risk of cruising, and here it's the kind of communal rewards of it. There's a real kind of sense of um, I think community in the kind of Berlin kind of queer culture that it depicts, and it's not presented as as dark or dangerous. It's just yeah, it's just everyday guys getting off in a way that makes them happy.
Yeah, I wish Al Pacino would have just worn that yellow bandana in his back seat of his pants and gotten pissed on, for us all to see. Uh, I
You say that about
do
every movie,
think
but
I
go
really
on.
do. I mean, it could liven up any movie.
Yeah.
But I really do think it could have paired well with Cruising. But at the same time, this one pairs well with Querelle for me, in that both of these feel like. I mean, I like being my age. I can't really fathom what it must have been like to see these movies as a queer person, like when they came out. Like it must have been like so shocking in a certain
Yeah,
way, in a delightful way, and they still are. They feel like they're from this alternate history where like Carell feels like it comes from like this alternate gay history where Hollywood was gay and there were lavish sets, and this is the kind of shit your mom watched, or like Gone with the Wind or something. And then this feels like like an alternate 80s where we were allowed to have explicit gay sex in movies, and it's especially the way that both of the movies are treated. Like both of the movies treat their subject matter in that they don't highlight it in this crazy like, well, can you believe what you're seeing kind of way. It really does feel like it comes from another place.
yeah,
uh,
and I think if TAXI ZUM KLO were released today, like Jaws would still kind of drop over the sheer kind of frankness of it.
Sure. I mean, yeah,
you can't even show
cruising.
boobs in Oppenheimer without people freaking the hell out these days.
Oh my God, can you believe
the most boring sex scene I've ever seen in my life. But that's another topic, I guess.
Cruising, like the feature for this like movie in particular is like the window into the location that they're in, because like there is such a like lush history of Berlin in the 70s and 80s that, you know, those who weren't there, like I'm always wondering about it, like David Bowie's Berlin, right? Like magical, like mysterious place of drugs and sex and everything, and you do get kind of a window into what it's like to just like live there, which like is kind of great because it's a window into how like, well, you know, I do those things, but I also have to work, and I also drive around aimlessly and worry about my life and stuff. I kind of love that aspect of it.
Yeah, which is very much kind of what Berlin is like as a city. It's like there's this kind of undercurrent of slight kind of decadence to it, and yet also kind of people just getting on with things and living their lives. And I think it's a great Valentine to Berlin that way.
Well, Guy, thank you so much for bringing these movies to our attention. Anybody listening, these are...
I don't know when I would have ever found this thing.
Absolutely.
I don't know why. It seems strangely hidden. It's kind of bizarre to me.
Yeah, I was looking for kind of seeing kind of what streaming platforms it was on kind of here in the UK, and there's nothing as well. It really is. I think it got like a re-release in the UK about 15 years ago or so, and it's ripe for another, I think.
Well, maybe the next time you get to pick a movie for a film festival, that will spur somebody to go get that out. But these are not movies to be afraid of, even though they're on this podcast. They're controversial at the time, but maybe don't watch the last one, like, I don't know, with your mom or something. But that's, unless you got a really cool mom, but, you know.
Oh, she deserves it. She got it coming.
She's good. So, but yeah, this was a blast. Thank you so much. And is there anything else, Guy, that you want to, plug or bring anyone's attention to you have coming up? This,
what are you up to?
Let's see. This will probably be coming out 2 weeks from tomorrow, as far as the date of recording.
I'll be at the Venice Film Festival at that point. So please, subscribe to Film of the Week. That's all I've got to say. We'll be doing Venice reviews as well. And read me at Variety and The Guardian. Can always be found there. So.
All right. Do you have any most anticipated movie from Venice?
I was gonna ask.
I really can't wait for the new Yorgos Lanthimos. It looks really warped and kinky, and that's exactly where I like him most. New Pablo Larraín looks fantastic. I think it's going to be a great year. That lineup is fire this year.
All right. Yeah, Yorgos Lanthimos had his own episode on this show, too. So we'll see how unwatchable the new one turns out to be. But yeah, very much looking forward to that. And thank you so much for your time. Well, my pleasure. Thank you.
Oh, yeah. Thank you, Guy.
Unwatchables is produced by Tony Scarpitti, hosted by me, Marc Dottavio, and Seth Troyer, with artwork by Micah Kraus. You can find Seth and I on Letterboxd under Marc Dottavio and Sloth Troyer. You can also check us out at unwatchablespod.com for links to our Twitter and Instagram, or support us on Patreon for bonus content and to have a say in what we watch. Thanks for listening.